What are the real lessons to be learned in the Afghanistan debacle? Join me in this week's Libertarian Angle as I examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the principled and uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, the free society. If you're brand new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org, where we've got 31 years worth of principled and compromising perspectives on liberty, especially in the context of the burning issues of the day. Subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Take a look at all the videos we have online on various aspects of libertarianism, again in the context of the controversies that besiege our land. And of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel. So, of course, the big news is the debacle in Afghanistan, and I want to talk about that this week. But I don't want to take the standard approach, which is, second-guessing President Biden and his decision to withdraw, or President Trump on his decision to enter into an agreement in which the United States would be committed to withdraw, or how Biden's handling the withdrawal. To me, all that's just window dressing. It doesn't really address the fundamentals. And if you look at most of the commentaries online, including from libertarians, it's complaining on how the occupation of Afghanistan was handled. That George W. Bush should have done this, and Clinton should have done that, and Obama should have done that, and Trump and Biden. And it's always this notion that if only they had done this, things would be different. There would be a democratic paradise where people's rights were being respected and modeled after the United States. In other words, everybody's got his own plan, his central plan for managing this invasion and occupation, and their only complaint is that their plan wasn't adopted. If only these presidents and the Pentagon and the CIA had adopted their plan, everything would be hunky-dory. That doesn't get us anywhere. There is no plan that can make foreign interventionism work, and that's one of the lessons that we really need to learn in this. And this is unfortunately what too many people still don't grasp, is that it is interventionism itself that is the problem. It's not forever wars. It's not the fact that the invasion and occupation were mismanaged. It is that the concept of foreign interventionism is wrong, it's immoral, it's evil, and that the U.S. government should not be engaged in this at all. Now, in order to properly analyze this debacle in Afghanistan, where really the troops have died for nothing. I mean, as much as U.S. soldiers may try to rationalize things here, the fact is they have died for nothing, and they've killed for nothing. In fact, my hunch is that the fact that they've killed all these people who had nothing to do with 9/11 is one of the major reasons why there's so much suicide, so many suicides taking place among U.S. soldiers now, is that they know they've killed people that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, which was the original justification for going into Afghanistan. So what I believe we need to do is to go back to the original intervention itself, to properly understand what happened here, and to gain the real lessons and as to what we need to do going forward as a nation. This is unfortunately what all too many commentators, including libertarians, don't want to do. They want to just keep focusing on, this should have happened and that should have happened. But the real root of this problem goes back to the 9/11 era. And, I remember those days well. I will never forget them. They were very, very difficult days for the Future of Freedom Foundation. It was the most difficult time in the 31-year history of this foundation. That's because there were a few of us, and we were very few, that were taking a principled stance against invading Afghanistan. And of course, we took the same stance against Iraq, but let's stick with Afghanistan. There were very, very few people that were opposing this invasion. Vengeance was in the air. The 9/11 attacks had come, and thousands of people had gotten killed, and and vengeance was the order of the day. People were screaming for vengeance against the Muslims, and there was talk about the caliphate and how the Muslims were coming to get us, and that we needed to strike back. And so FFF took a very principled stand and said this is a very wrong-headed decision, and you would not believe the hate mail that we got. I mean, it was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. You're a traitor. You love the terrorists. You're cowards. You would just let these people kill us. And we lost supporters. Donors were canceling us. And, you know, there were lots of libertarians, especially the conservative-oriented libertarians, that immediately jumped on the bandwagon. I mean, they saw that there was a sea change in public opinion, that everybody saw this as a war. You know, that it was like, you know, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, the Muslims have attacked America, and we now need to mobilize to go to war. And so those of us that were opposing this thing were, you know, we were looked on as the peaceniks, the cowards, and so forth. And man, you wouldn't believe, like I say, the hate mail that was coming in, and the loss of donations that we experienced, but we never wavered. We never wavered one iota, because I knew that this was going to be an absolute horrendous debacle and disaster at some point. And so what I want to do is to go back to those days, because today there's some people who are saying, oh, it was right to invade. It was just the way it was managed. It was nation building, and it was just democracy building, and that's the real problem here. But it was right to invade, they say. No, it wasn't. It was the worst thing. The invasion leads to the occupation, which leads to this 20-year forever war, which leads to the Taliban defeated the U.S. military and the CIA. They both got defeated here. So I want to go back, and I want to break down exactly what was happening in the run-up to that invasion of Afghanistan. Now, one argument that the interventionists make is that, well, the U.S. had the right to go in there and, as a policeman, international policeman, and capture or kill those who were suspected of being involved in the 9/11 attacks. And of course, the leader of the gang that was supposedly responsible for this was Osama bin Laden. And so bin Laden was apparently ensconced there in Afghanistan, and therefore the U.S. had the right to invade the country to effect his capture. Now let's just set aside the Taliban, the Afghan government, which was the Afghan government at the time. Let's just focus only on bin Laden. That the interventionists say the U.S. had the authority to do that because they were convinced, and they said they had evidence that it was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden who had orchestrated this attack. However, where does that authority arise from? I mean, where is it? And this is where the interventionists, including libertarians, said, oh, this is an act of war. This is an act of war. We have the right to invade Afghanistan because to defend ourselves. But you see, it was never an act of war. I mean, that sold well during that period of time when, you know, 90% or whatever the number is of Americans were ready to do anything to wreak vengeance. You know, the anger was palpable, and the anger was justified. I mean, you know, here thousands of people had died at 9/11, and so it's understandable that people were angry, but they let it interfere with their reasoning process. It was never an act of war. This is a gang, and the charge was terrorism. Terrorism is not an act of war. And if you don't believe me, just look in the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code lists all the criminal conduct that under federal law, and terrorism is right there in the U.S. Code. It's a criminal offense. I mean, we know this to be a fact because there's terrorism cases that are prosecuted regularly over there in Virginia, as well as in D.C., sometimes in New York, and they're prosecuted in federal district court. So, and the reason they are is because terrorism is a federal criminal offense. So what we're talking about here is a federal criminal offense that somebody in Afghanistan supposedly has committed here in the United States. Does that give the U.S. authority to invade a foreign country to effect the capture of this? of this suspected malefactor or the gang in which he's involved? Well, let's take an example. Let's assume that some Cuban exiles in Miami go over to Cuba and effect a terrorist attack that kills 100 people in a hotel there. And then they come back to the United States. Does that then authorize the Cuban government to invade the United States to effect the capture of those? Suppose they demand that the United States extradite those suspected terrorists to Cuba. And let's assume the U.S. government says, we don't have an extradition treaty with you. We don't have to extradite them. And Cuba says, but we're certain they did this. And the U.S. says, well, that's just the way it goes. We can't turn them over to you because we don't have an extradition treaty with you. And that's the whole idea behind extradition treaties, is that when somebody is suspected of a crime that's been committed that is in some other country, that country with whom an extradition treaty has been entered into can then deliver that person based on evidence provided at the extradition hearing to the government that's accusing that person of having committed the crime. So what happens in that case? Well, let's say Cuba invades Florida and starts looking for this gang of terrorists or suspected terrorists. Well, how long would the U.S. government permit that to go on? Let's say they say, okay, you've got 6 months. And in those 6 months, the Cuban regime is going across the land with its army, banging down doors, looking for these guys. They happen to kill some Americans in the process. They learn that the suspects are holed up in some woods nearby. They start dropping bombs from the Cuban Air Force, kills a few Americans. So let's say that the American government says, okay, 6 months have now gone by. You've had enough time. You haven't found these guys. You have to go back home. And the Cuban regime says, no, we have a right to be here. These are suspected terrorists. We're going to stay indefinitely. Now, I got a feeling that the U.S. government, after 6 months of this, would say, well, no, we're getting tired of it. I got a feeling the American people would get tired of it. In fact, I think there's a good possibility that the U.S. government would never permit such an invasion, that they would consider it an act of aggression, and they would do their best to stop this invasion from even getting started. Well, and that would be the right thing to do, that just because Cuba suspects that there's terrorists over here, Cuban exiles that have committed this terrorist attack, means that they just can't do anything about it. That's just the way it is. If they want something to do, if they want to be able to do things to these guys, they have to enter into the extradition treaty. Well, that's what was happening with Afghanistan. I mean, the U.S. never had any authority to invade the country, to do these things. And what we were arguing at the time was that it's a horrible idea to invade the country to bring these guys to justice. For one thing, you're not sure you're going to find them. But more important, you're going to kill a lot of people in the process of trying to find these guys. A lot of innocent Afghan people, because an invasion necessarily involves killing people, dropping bombs, looking for these guys, dropping bombs where you think they are. Inevitably, there's going to be people killing. So even if they had invaded and totally ignored the Taliban, totally ignored the Afghan government, they're going to be going through villages, they're going to be knocking down doors, they're going to be killing people who are resisting their invasion, because inevitably, just like here in the United States, if the Cubans invaded, there would be people saying, get out of my country. And I have no doubts that there would be people in Florida that are well armed that would be shooting at the Cuban army as it was marauding across the land, killing American people. Well, it's no different in Afghanistan. Nobody likes an invader or an occupier. And so there would have been people attacking these troops, and then the troops would be saying, well, we're just defending ourselves after we've invaded this country. So you're going to be seeing a lot of deaths of people that had nothing to do with 9/11. And we kept saying that you're going to wreak a lot of anger and suffering among the Afghan people. And then you're going to generate more of what produced the 9/11 attacks, more terrorism. Because as people are killed, they lose family members, they get angry and they want retaliation. And that retaliation inevitably comes in the form of terrorism. So we kept arguing this is the worst thing. So what did we argue at the time? We said, look, just sit back and wait. Wait him out. That, if you truly convinced him Osama bin Laden did this, you put out an international warrant. That's what Interpol's all about. And you just wait him out. Now, that waiting out may take, a year, 2 years. You never know. I mean, he may even be able to escape justice. Right now, there's people in Cuba who the federal government accuses of having committed crimes over here, including killing cops. And the Cuban regime refuses to extradite them. Well, the U.S. doesn't go in there, invade, and start dropping bombs on Cuba and so forth. Some of these people die over there in Cuba. They escape justice. That's the way it is sometimes in the judicial realm. That sometimes guilty people who've committed crimes, get away with it. But if we go back to 1993, it provides a good example of what I'm talking about. In 1993, there was an attack on the World Trade Center. It was no different in principle than the attacks on 9/11. Okay, and the attacks on 9/11 were on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. It was no different in 1993. The difference is that lots of people got killed on 9/11, and I'm not sure anybody got killed in 1993. I think there was a lot of property damage. Maybe there were some injuries. But it wasn't this massive catastrophe because they had not succeeded in bringing down the World Trade Center as they ultimately succeeded in 2001. But still, it was a terrorist attack. I mean, there's no question about it. And one of the people who were suspected of this attack was a guy named Ramzi Youssef. And he got away. I'm not sure exactly how he got away, but he escaped the country. And he ended up in Pakistan. Well, they waited him out. They couldn't find him. They waited him out. Finally, they got information that he was in Pakistan. I think this was maybe a couple years after the attack. And they don't invade Pakistan. An invasion there would have cost the lives of countless Pakistani people who had nothing to do with the 93 attack. I mean, this is one guy that they're looking for. And so they wait him out, and they finally get some information as to where he is. And then in cooperation with the Pakistani authorities, they go in there and they effect that arrest, and they bring him back. And they put him on trial. Okay, remember, it's not an act of war. They put him in federal district court. They have him indicted criminally by a federal grand jury, and he is made to stand trial. And he is convicted. Now, so there you have an example of where you wait out a guy that is suspected of a terrorist attack. It may take 1 or 2 years, but you end up bringing him to justice without killing masses of people in Pakistan or anywhere else. In other words, you let the criminal justice system operate to bring to justice somebody who has violated criminal law. Compare that to what happened in Afghanistan, where they killed multitudes of people. I don't know what the numbers are, but they range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, massive suffering, not to mention the destruction of property, infrastructure, destroying the whole country. And then they don't even capture the guy or kill the guy. He's gone. I mean, he's nowhere to be found. And later, it's discovered that he's in Pakistan. But notice they don't invade Pakistan. They ended up doing some kind of raid there later on. But it didn't involve massive killings of people. So what I'm saying is that this was a debacle from the very beginning. And this is what a lot of the commentators simply could not grasp at the time, including the conservative-oriented libertarians. They were all on board with this invasion. That it was really a case of using the military to operate as an international police force with massive force that killed countless innocent people. Now, there's another factor involved here, and that is, what was the cause of this terrorist attack? What was motivating it? And this is one of the things we brought up in 1993, in 2001, that just drove people ballistic. I mean, it just drove them crazy because we said, look at the cause of this. This is what motivates these people. And what is it? It's U.S. interventionism. And again, this is something that commentators did not want to talk about. As soon as George W. Bush says, the terrorists hate us for our freedom and values, that was it. Case closed. I mean, it was like they treated terrorism as like the flu, like the coronavirus. Like, oh gosh, terrorism has hit other countries and it's finally come to America. The virus has hit America. Woe is us. Oh, it had to happen because they hate us for our rock and roll and our Christian churches, and there's an international, centuries-old conspiracy to establish a caliphate, and the Muslims are coming to get us. This is pure nonsense. But nobody wanted to hear that. I went and gave a speech to a libertarian group soon after the 9/11 attacks, where I talked about we need to analyze the U.S. role in creating the anger and hatred that went into these attacks. And man, the conservative-oriented libertarians, they went after me with a vengeance. Oh, you're blaming America. You're blaming America. And those of you that were living around this time, remember that phrase. Oh, you're blaming America. You're blaming America. No. What we're doing is we're trying to analyze what is the cause of this attack, the motivating factor, so that in the long run, we don't have this problem anymore. We don't want the terrorism problem. And if we don't analyze and figure out what the motivating cause is, then we're flying blind. But by focusing on the cause of the problem, then you can eliminate the problem. And it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what the cause of this problem was. That the 9/11 attacks had been motivated by anger and outrage over what the U.S. government had been doing with interventionism prior to the 9/11 attacks. If you go back to the Ramzi Youssef case, this is in '93. At his sentencing hearing, I mean, you can sense the guy's anger and rage, really. He starts lashing out at the federal judge who was getting ready to sentence him. That's usually not a good policy for a defendant to do. But he was so filled with rage, he tells the judge, he says, you call us the butchers? You are the butchers. You're over here killing innocent children in Iraq with your sanctions. You are the butchers. What nation dares to kill innocent children? And of course, the federal judge, it just goes right over his head, presumably, because it's like they don't want to think about that the U.S. government has done something to cause this anger and rage. They want to just go off on this freedom and values kick. And so Ramzi Youssef, of course, his words were not taken seriously. But if you look at the terrorist attacks that preceded 9/11, you've got the attack on the USS Cole, of course, the '93 attack on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa, the U.S. embassies. I mean, all of these, they said, this is because of what you're doing here in the Middle East. And they were referring to, of course, to the Persian Gulf intervention that killed countless Iraqis, the sanctions that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. You got Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, that comes out with her infamous statement that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions, while difficult, was worth it. And you've got the unconditional support of the Israeli government, regardless of whatever it does to the Palestinians. You had stationing of U.S. troops on Islamic Holy Lands or near the Islamic Holy Lands. I mean, all this is like a cauldron of boiling water. And people told the U.S., I mean, if you look at a guy like Chalmers Johnson, look up Chalmers Johnson on the internet. I mean, this guy had the best analysis ever during these times. He's got 4 fantastic books, but you can find a lot of essays online. His essays are timeless. You can benefit from reading them now. He wrote a book before 9/11 called Blowback, where he said, if you keep doing this, you're going to get a terrorist attack on American soil. He wasn't the only one. We were publishing op-eds saying this. But, see, nobody wanted to pay attention to that. And then when it happens, and we said, see, this is what we've been saying. Oh, no, Jacob. No, you're trying to justify what they did. You're trying to defend what they did, Jacob. You're defending the terrorists. You love the terrorists, Jacob. That's the kind of tripe we got after the 9/11 attacks when we were raising the root cause of these attacks. So by analyzing that, understanding that interventionism is what produces the terrorism, if you end the interventionism, you end the terrorism. And then you don't need a global war on terrorism, and you don't need a Patriot Act, and you can restore a sense of harmony to American society. But by invading Afghanistan for vengeance or to seek out Osama bin Laden and killing countless people and then followed by Iraq, what you're doing is you're doing more interventionism. You're killing more people that then generates more anger and more outrage, and which then leads to more terrorism. And so it's this vicious cycle. That's why they called it an endless war in the very beginning, that this global war on terrorism is going to go on for a long time, indefinitely. I mean, it was better than their Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War, they had the Soviet Union and godless communism as their official enemies, and they thought that would never go away. I mean, man, the military-industrial complex, the CIA, the NSA, they were in high cotton during the Cold War. Big budgets, big influence, big power, ever-increasing power within the federal governmental structure. Then suddenly it came to an end. But then they start intervening in the Middle East, Persian Gulf intervention, the sanctions, and so forth. And that gives them this new official enemy, the Muslims or terrorism and the global war on terrorism. And the money started flowing out even more than it did during the Cold War with the so-called defense contractors and so forth. Now let's shift to the Taliban for a minute. People say, oh, the Taliban were harboring the terrorists, Jacob. We couldn't have that. We had to wage war against the people who were harboring the terrorists. And what does they mean? What do they mean by harboring? Now, keep in mind, for one thing, that they never got a declaration of war against Afghanistan. That made the war illegal from the very beginning, both the invasion and the occupation. Our Constitution is very clear. The president cannot wage war without a congressional declaration of war. And the reason for this is the framers and our American ancestors didn't want the president making that call. They didn't want the military making that call. They wanted Congress to make that call. And so with the declaration of war, the president has to come and make his case. It's to show why this is the case, why that he should be permitted to invade. And of course, he never did that. Now, harboring, what does that really mean? If these Cuban exiles that attack Cuba come back and they refuse to go to Cuba voluntarily to stand trial, and the U.S. refuses to turn over, is the U.S. harboring terrorists? Of course not. There's no extradition treaty, as I pointed out earlier. The U.S. is not required to extradite these people to Cuba. And so the fact that they don't extradite them, that doesn't mean they're harboring them. It simply means that they're complying with the law. And that's what happened here. There was never any accusation that the Taliban were complicit in these attacks, in the sense that they knew they were going to happen, that they were harboring these terrorists knowingly and deliberately and intentionally, knowing that they were going to engage in these attacks. There was never any evidence of that. If there was evidence of that, do you think President Bush would have gone to the United Nations and asked for permission to invade Afghanistan? That's ridiculous. A nation that attacked, if the Taliban regime had been complicit, participating in this knowingly, there would have been no reason to go to the United Nations. You just go to Congress and say, here's the evidence. The Taliban has attacked us through Al-Qaeda, given me my declaration of war, so that there would be a double-pronged activity going on here. One, go after the Afghan government in a war against the Afghan government, the nation, and then the second one, the police action to try to find or capture bin Laden in the process. Well, in fact, George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban deliver Osama bin Laden over. So there was this demand. There's an extradition demand that denies that the Taliban regime was complicit in these attacks. Because if they'd been complicit, such a demand wouldn't even have been made. The U.S. would have just invaded. And so the Taliban regime says, well, we don't have an extradition treaty. We can't do this. But knowing that they would have no chance of standing up to the U.S. in a war, at least in the short term, they said, look, we're willing to consider an extradition to an independent third country. Because the U.S. wanted them to extradite them not over to the U.S. judicial system, but to deliver them to the Pentagon and the CIA, which, of course, we know what that would mean, either torture or extrajudicial execution, that type of thing. And the Taliban regime knew that. And so they said, look, why don't we talk in terms of delivering him to an independent third country, whether it's Switzerland or whatever, and let them try him. But you bring us your evidence as if it were an extradition trial. I mean, that's the way extradition works. That you have to go in there and provide evidence that there's at least probable cause or whatever the test is that this person has committed the crime and therefore should be extradited. Bush said no. No, you will turn him over to us unconditionally. We don't care if there's an extradition treaty. You do as we say. And the Taliban said no. And Bush says, well, then I'm going to invade your country. I'm going to order a wholesale invasion. And that's why the invasion against the Taliban, the Afghan regime, took place. Not because of this harboring argument, where the notion is that the Taliban was somehow complicit in these attacks. It was because they refused to obey Bush's orders to extradite bin Laden. So the invasion takes place, and okay, so it takes 20 years, but to show what a debacle it was. I mean, 2,500 troops killed, but I mean, how many Afghanis have been killed? I've read over 200,000. Their whole country destroyed, people tortured, and none of them, or I should say virtually none of them, had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. And then the mission morphs into, we're going to establish enduring freedom, and we're going to have this wonderful paradise of democracy and freedom and so forth. And as it turns out, they were lying the whole time on the progress of the war. And that's not unusual. I mean, the national security establishment is based on lies. I mean, they thrive on lies. Their whole existence is based on lies. It has been from the very beginning. And that's the second lesson. Now, the first lesson that needs to be drawn here, and this is what should be discussed and debated all across America, not who mismanaged the war and the occupation and whether Biden's handling the evacuation properly or not. What needs to be discussed and debated is the concept of foreign interventionism. Our country was founded on a principle of non-interventionism. That's in John Quincy Adams' famous 4th of July speech in 1821. You just don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, whether it's bin Laden or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or whatever. You stay here and you limit your government to defending your own country. So you get rid of foreign aid, coups, invasions, alliances with foreign dictatorial regimes, alliances with everybody, and you limit your country to defense, like Switzerland does. And nobody jacks with the Swiss, I guarantee you that. And not even Hitler wanted to jack with the Swiss. So you limit your government to defense. But the second lesson we have to be discussing and debating is what type of governmental structure we have. We were founded as a limited government republic. Virtually full transparency in government operations, very limited powers, and that's the way the American people wanted it. Now we live under what's called a national security state type of governmental system. Omnipotent powers, powers of assassination, powers of torture, powers of secret surveillance. I mean, it's omnipotent government. I mean, that's the title of one of Ludwig von Mises's books. Omnipotent government. Omnipotent government is contrary to freedom. A free society and omnipotent government are opposites. And yet here we live under this type of system, which is the same type of system in North Korea, China, Russia, Egypt, Pakistan. They're all national security states. So why are we still a national security state when our founding governmental system was a limited government republic with just a basic military force, not this giant ever-growing, vast military establishment, what President Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex, this army of defense contractors, and we put defense in quotation marks because they're not defending America. They're out there intervening around the world. The CIA, the NSA, all these things are inconsistent with a free society. So if there's any lesson to be learned here at all, it's that we need to be discussing and debating things at a higher level. The concept of foreign interventionism itself, and the concept of what type of governmental system we're going to have moving forward in order to restore freedom and peace, prosperity, and harmony to our land, and that's a limited government republic. So that's my perspective this week on Libertarian Angle. Thank you for tuning in. Again, come and visit us at fff.org. 31 years of articles, and videos, and commentaries, all from a principled libertarian standpoint. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. If you like our work, we could sure use your donations. We've got a great conference coming up, and that's going to be Restoring Civil Liberties. It's got a great lineup of speakers, starts in mid-September, so it'll run every week through mid-November. And so we invite you to register for that. And the details are now going up on the website. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you all next week.